legislative days, so members may submit any materials they wish to be included therein. Thank you, Ranking Member Torres, members of the subcommittee, and Chief Sund for joining us in today's oversight hearing. Today, we're focused on identifying the numerous security failures that preceded and continue to persist following the breach of the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021. Although it has been more than 2 years, there are still many unanswered questions. Former Speaker Pelosi and House Democrats spent millions of dollars on their select committee to investigate January 6, yet the committee failed to investigate the real security failures. Today, we are joined by Chief Sund, who was Chief of the United States Police, Capitol Police on that day. The Democrat Select Committee never invited Chief Sund to testify during one of their primetime hearings, despite him being the Chief of Police on January 6. Perhaps that is because his testimony didn't fit with their preconceived narrative. For months leading up to January 6th, House Democrats championed the anti-police, defund the police narrative. House Democrats continued pushing this dangerous narrative through the appropriations process, where they threatened to cut Capitol Police's budget. This politicization of the Capitol Police directly contributed to many of the structural and procedural failures we witnessed that day. Let me be clear. I stand with law enforcement, specifically our Capitol Police officers, and appreciate their dedication, bravery, and service. I hope my Democrat colleagues do the same. We now know that serious structural failures within the Capitol Police Intelligence Department contributed to the terrible events of that day. This includes misplaced and misguided goals, as well as key intelligence failures that resulted in timely warnings not reaching the Capitol Police leadership. And instead of doing a comprehensive assessment of these intelligence failures, Chief Sund was pushed out and the new leadership silenced individuals who spoke about these failures. Retaliation against whistleblowers is unacceptable. This is one of the reasons why House Republicans are conducting this investigation. I look forward to hearing Chief Sund's view regarding the multiple accusations of retaliation that are now public. I also look forward to hearing directly from Chief Sund about the general operation of Capitol Police, including day-to-day relations with the Capitol Police Board, as well as the Speaker of the House. Chief Sund's testimony today will provide transparency, accountability, and most importantly, help to prevent anything like this from happening again. Finally, we will focus on the aftermath of January 6 and the ensuing witch hunt conducted by the Select Committee on January 6, of which I was, unfortunately, a target. Throughout their nearly 2 years of work, the Select Committee clearly operated on hearsay and cherry-picked so-called evidence to fit their desired narrative. When the Select Committee published their final report in December of 2022, it was clear that their multi-million-dollar committee effort was a political weapon focused at attacking former President Trump and his supporters instead of how to prevent another incident. We must ask ourselves why the Capitol was ill-prepared and what security changes are needed to ensure adequate Capitol security, a question the January 6th Select Committee failed to scrutinize. This was preventable, and we must ensure nothing like this ever happens again. I now recognize the ranking member, Ms. Torres, for 5 minutes for the purpose of providing an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there, be wild. On December 19, 2020, former President Donald Trump, the leader of the Republican Party, sent those fateful words to his supporters, and they complied. Following that directive, the National Intelligence Threat Consortium noticed a 1,000% increase in violent rhetoric against members of Congress and law enforcement officers. In the weeks and months leading up to the January 6th, Trump continued to incite unrest, accusing Democrats of rigging the election and referring to it as the biggest scam in our nation's history. On New Year's Day, he tweeted, "January 6th, see you in D.C." On the morning of the attack at the Stop the Steal rally on the Ellipse, a Republican member of Congress told the crowd, "Today is the day American patriots start taking down names and kicking ass. And our ancestors sacrificed their blood, their sweat, their tears, their fortunes, and sometimes their lives. Are you willing to do the same?" Rudy Giuliani continued the violence to incite the armed crowd by asking for a trial by combat. while Donald Trump told his supporters, "We're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down to the Capitol." The former president orchestrated a corrupt scheme to overturn the results of a free and fair election, and when that didn't work, he incited his supporters to violence. Updated via social media and directed by the former president, the crowd marched to the Capitol armed with guns, handcuffs, and pepper spray. If they didn't bring a weapon, they found one, viciously beating our officers with poles bearing the American flag, destroying property, and erecting gallows to hang Vice President Pence. The former president bears full responsibility for bringing violence to the Capitol. I spoke with some of the heroic Capitol Police officers who were injured and beaten that day by the violent mob and still face the enduring pain of that traumatic day. If not for the heroic actions of law enforcement officers, some of whom literally gave their lives to protect us, the former president and his supporters would have succeeded. Immediately, Speaker Pelosi engaged with retired United States Army General Russell Honore to conduct a complete security assessment of the Capitol to identify vulnerabilities. In addition to the work of the Honore Task Force, former Chair Zoe Lofgren of this committee instructed the U.S. Capitol Police Inspector General to halt all ongoing investigations and devote all resources to investigating the attack. House Democrats then directed the Government Accountability Office to perform a government-wide examination of the attack, including a comprehensive review of agency preparation and response. Still, after Republicans refused to support legislation to create an independent national commission, the Bipartisan Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack took up this work. In addition to the many investigations, we passed a funding bill to equip the institution with adequate resources to address our security needs. The law also established the Howard C. Liebengood Center for Wellness, named in honor of a U.S. Capitol Police officer who tragically took his life following the attack, to ensure that his partners on the force have access to care as they continue to heal from the traumatic events of a violent insurrection. We are still reckoning with the fallout from January 6th, collectively as a country and as individuals. The American democratic experiment came dangerously close to ending, if not for the courageous actions of the Capitol and DC police. And the person responsible for directing the violence to the Capitol that day in order to undermine a peaceful transfer of power is the favorite to secure the Republican nomination for president. Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record the following: an excerpt from the congressional record dated January 13, 2021, containing then Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy's remarks during the debate on former President Trump's impeachment for incitement of insurrection, executive summaries of the 8 flash reports examining the preparation for and response to the January 6th attack, prepared by the Capitol Police Inspector General, the Capitol Police Inspector General's testimony from each hearing in a series of hearings convened by this committee examining his flash reports, testimony from a hearing convened by this committee in 2021 entitled Reforming the Capitol Police and Improving Accountability for the Capitol Police Board, a summary of Lieutenant Honore's Task Force 1-6 Capitol Security Review, and Washington Post article dated September 6, 2023, entitled Trump's 2020 Crusade Has Led to 700 Years in Prison Sentences, and I yield back.
Without objection, the gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize full committee ranking member, Mr. Morelli, for 5 minutes for the purpose of providing an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing. And I also want to thank my colleague and the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Torres, for her work. I want to thank Chief Sund not only for being here today to offer testimony, sir, but also for your service to the Capitol Police and to our country. So I appreciate that. I think whenever we're talking about January 6th, I think it's important we have a fuller picture of what the House majority did in the aftermath of the attack, particularly for those who seem to have developed a case of collective amnesia. And I do want to set the record straight. In the days and weeks following the violent mob's attack and ransacking of the United States Capitol, House Democrats immediately got to work. And the work started with the speakers immediately ordering a nonpartisan, forward-looking, and comprehensive security review of the Capitol and its support agencies, and that was spearheaded by General Russell Honore. This committee, I was not a member of the committee at the time, but the committee then directed the United States Capitol Police Inspector General to temporarily set aside the office's ongoing work and prioritize a comprehensive nonpartisan review of the USPC's preparation for and response to the attack. And concurrently, the architect of the Capitol, Inspector General, conducted similar assessments of the Capitol complex's physical security. So upon issuance of each IG report, this committee, held a series of public hearings, 6 in total, to review the findings and to question the respective inspectors general. A series of reports culminated in more than 100 recommendations to improve the operations of the Capitol Police, harden the security of the Capitol complex, and protect the people within, which is, of course, our large responsibility here. But the work didn't stop there. While the Committee on House Administration conducted its important work, it was evident a broader inquiry was necessary to fully investigate and understand the attack, not just to hold those involved accountable, but to provide the American public with answers to basic questions. So towards that end, legislation was introduced to establish an outside independent commission to investigate and report on the facts and the causes of the attack. The bill was developed with input from both parties, and that bipartisan framework was reflected in the final text considered by the House. And I just recall, because he was a friend and a colleague of mine, John Katko, member of the House Republican caucus, who was asked to help negotiate the deal, did so. And then inexplicably, at the time, Minority Leader McCarthy declared his opposition to the bill, a bill which was characterized by his own handpicked negotiator, John Katko, as a solid, fair agreement. Regardless, we pressed on and got the bill through the House on a bipartisan basis, only for it to ultimately fail due to a Republican filibuster. With the prospects of an independent commission growing bleaker, despite good faith efforts by the Speaker to work collaboratively with the Minority Leader, the House then voted to impanel a bipartisan select committee to investigate the attack, and it was constituted by appointments from both the Speaker and the Minority Leader. Again, at the last minute, the Minority Leader withdrew his appointments to the Select Committee. Although impossible to exhaustively list the entirety of its work in the brief 5 minutes I'm afforded here, the Select Committee interviewed hundreds of subjects, including riot participants and government officials, combed through thousands of hours of video footage and hundreds of thousands of pages of documents, held 10 public televised hearings, and issued a final report which devoted 2 appendices to examining the preparation and response of government agencies and the D.C. National Guard. But we didn't just end the investigation there, nor did we just investigate the attack itself. We passed laws that provided increased security funding for the Capitol complex, made sure officers struggling from the physical and emotional trauma of that day had access to the care they need and deserve. We brought transparency to the Capitol Police Board and made it easier to mobilize outside assistance in the event of an emergency. The Capitol Police were there for us, so we wanted to be there for them. January 6th is among the darkest stains on this country's historic fabric. An armed and violent mob attempted to forcefully disrupt the peaceful transfer of power and subvert the will of the American people at the behest of an increasingly desperate former president. But we also witnessed incredible bravery on that day by the Capitol Police, acts of genuine heroism that kept us safe and kept our beloved democratic experiment alive, and I'm forever grateful to the Capitol Police for that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. No, decorum is present. Without objection, the chair may declare recess at any time. Without objection, all other members' opening statements will be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the committee by 5 p.m. today. Pursuant to paragraph B of Committee Rule 6, the witness will please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witness has answered in the affirmative, and you may be seated, Chief. I'd like to now introduce our witness, Chief Stephen Sund. Chief Stephen Sund served for over 25 years with the Metropolitan Police Department, where he rose through the ranks to become the commander of the Elite Special Operations Division, overseeing some of the most critical units within the department. In 2017, he was selected as the Assistant Chief of Police, and on June 13, 2019, Sund was named the 10th Chief of the United States Capitol Police, where he served for 18 months. In January 2023, Chief Sund published a book about the institutional failings entitled Courage Under Fire, Under Siege and Outnumbered 58-1 on January 6. Chief Sund, we appreciate you being here today and look forward to your testimony. As a reminder, we have read your written statement and it will appear in the full committee record. Under Committee Rule 9, you are to limit your oral presentation to a brief summary of your written statement unless I extend this time period in consultation with Ranking Member Torres. Please remember to turn on your microphone using the button in front of you so that members can hear you. When you begin to speak, the light on the timer in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow. And when the red light comes on, I ask that you please wrap up, as that indicates your 5 minutes has expired. I now recognize Chief Sund for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Loudermilk, Ranking Member Torres, and members of the subcommittee. It is hard to believe that it has been almost 3 years since January 6th, and we are still having congressional hearings to identify what contributed to that tragic day. To date, there have been 4 congressional reports, along with several Inspector General and Government Accountability Office reports, and they continue to support what many of us have suspected from the very beginning. January 6th was an intelligence failure. We rely on accurate intelligence to help us develop effective security and operational plans. Accurate intelligence is an essential factor in the decision-making process of the Capitol Police Board, and the oversight committees. We now know that significant intelligence existed, that individuals were plotting to storm the Capitol building, target lawmakers, and discussing shooting my officers. And yet no intel agencies or units sounded the alarm. We were blindsided. Intelligence failed operations. The January 6th attack at the Capitol was preventable. If the intelligence had been accurately reported and the FBI and DHS had followed their policies and established practices, I wouldn't be sitting here today. There was a failure to connect the dots on 9/11 and again on January 6th. I'm concerned if we do not identify and correct these issues, we may fail again in the future. I did everything I could to protect and defend the U.S. Capitol and the members of Congress prior to and on January 3rd. Prior to January 6th and prior to and on January 6th. On January 3rd, I requested the assistance of the National Guard to support my perimeter and was denied by the 2 sergeant-at-arms over the concern for politics and optics. Still concerned for the number of personnel I had on my perimeter, I called the MPD earlier on the morning of January 6th and asked if they could stage additional personnel closer to the Capitol on Constitution Avenue. Less than 2 hours later, we were violently attacked on the west front of the Capitol at 12:53 p.m. I immediately followed up on that morning call and contacted MPD Chief Carroll at 12:55 p.m. and requested those resources. MPD was on the scene within minutes and were assisting my officers in holding the line and delaying the breach of the building. It took 81 agonizing minutes for that mob to fight their way through numerous police lines before they were able to breach the Capitol. The decision to reach out to MPD proved critical in safeguarding the members of Congress. Minutes after the attack began, I made my first call to House Sergeant-at-Arms Paul Irving at 12:58 p.m. to request approval to bring in the National Guard. "Let me run it up the chain, and I will get back to you," was his response. It would be 71 minutes before that approval would finally come. Between 12:58 and when I finally received approval for the National Guard at 2:09 p.m., I made 32 calls to coordinate support from my officers, including at least 11 frustrating calls to the Sergeant-at-Arms regarding my request for the National Guard. My calls to my partner law enforcement agencies resulted in hundreds of police officers from around the National Capital Region and as far away as New Jersey responding to assist. After I received approval to call in the National Guard, I then had to beg the Pentagon officials to send us help. I was repeatedly denied assistance by the Army Lieutenant General Pyatt, citing concerns over optics of the National Guard on Capitol Hill. The D.C. National Guard, many of whom were standing within eyesight of the Capitol, and whose motto is Capitol Guardians, would not arrive until almost 6 p.m. after the fighting was over and the Capitol grounds secured. The New Jersey State Police arrived before they did. To add insult to injury, the Inspector General for the Department of Defense considered the response, quote, appropriate. Besides the MPD, the National Guard was the next largest cadre of personnel that could be deployed to assist my officers. We desperately needed those boots on the ground. The fact that the Chief of Police, responsible for the entire legislative branch of government, was repeatedly denied assistance by the Pentagon is indefensible. The fact that an experienced law enforcement official was constrained by federal law from bringing in life-saving resources for his officers is unfathomable. This type of politicized control over and oversight was and continues to be detrimental to the mission. Why bring in an experienced police chief if you are not going to allow him to do his job? In December 2021, Congress amended 2 U.S.C. 1970, the law that restricted my ability to bring in federal resources. While the amendment now grants the chief authority to call in federal resources only during an emergency, it does not grant the chief authority to request federal resources in advance of an event, which means the request can still be denied. In other words, the law still requires the chief to seek advance approval from the Capitol Police Board and congressional leadership. This is exactly what I faced on January 3rd. It should also be noted that the new amendment makes the chief emergency authorization revocable. I am extremely proud and appreciative of the Capitol Police officers, the Metropolitan Police Department, and the other law enforcement agencies that came to our assistance. Despite bureaucratic issues on the Hill and a no-show by the military, it was law enforcement that saved the day, and not a single member of Congress was injured. Thanks to the assisting law enforcement, the men and women of the Capitol Police did not fail in their mission. In conclusion, I ask that this committee address the institutional failures that contributed to January 6th. I also implore the committee to have an independent entity investigate the complaints and allegations of retaliation against intel whistleblowers following January 6th, and to review any of the personnel actions, to include disciplinary actions that occurred following January 6th, to ensure they were properly investigated and not subject to any inappropriate actions, coercion, influences, or predetermined outcomes. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Chief Sund. Now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Chief Sund, some have characterized January 6th as an intelligence failure. Is it true that when you were Chief of Police, Ms. Yogananda Pittman was the Assistant Chief of Police in charge of the Intelligence Division, yes or no?
Yes, sir.
In your book, I believe you wrote that the information regarding potential threats prior to January 6th was received by the United States Capitol Police Intelligence Division, but you were not made aware of it until after January 6th. Is that correct, yes or no?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Had you seen the United States Capitol Police Intelligence Assessment Report in full issued on January 4th before January 6th, yes or no?
Yes, sir.
You had seen the January 4th report.
When you say January 4th, it's dated, now I just want to make sure there is a January 4th report. It's a Department of Intelligence, a daily intelligence report. That one?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
All right. Would this intelligence assessment report have changed your actions had you received it and fully understood all the ramifications of it?
When you say fully understood the ramifications of it, there is nothing supporting.
Well, what I'm getting to is that apparently, and what I've understood was that as Chief of Police, you received the report, but there was a comment about some intelligence or about some concerns, but it was put on the last page of the report instead of on the first page. Is that accurate?
Okay, yeah, just to make sure we're clear, you're referring to the January 3rd.
January 3rd,
It's actually
all right.
dated, yeah, January 3rd, it's dated 2020, it's supposed to be 2021.
Yeah, okay.
And that's the final intelligence assessment, but not the final intelligence report that's put out.
All right.
That's
Sorry, I
correct.
got my lingo mixed up.
No problem. It's a 15-page report with the intelligence assessment at the end behind 2.5 pages of street closures. Correct, sir.
Well, wouldn't you expect there to be some kind of a warning on the front page or an alert or a highlighting of the fact that there might be a concern by your intelligence department?
When you see the amount of intelligence that they had in advance, and you can look at some of the testimony from the people that put it together, there was a failure to include specific intelligence that would have been critical to my men and women to be better prepared for that day, yes.
All right, just so I'm clear, because I'm not sure I understood the answer. Was there something highlighted in the report, or was it that there wasn't information that you needed to get to your officers?
Yeah, there wasn't information. There was when you talk about the assessment, the intelligence assessment, the very last paragraph doesn't tell you anything other than pretty much what we're expecting from any of the previous MAGA rallies, that it could be, there could be some danger, there could be some
So it was a fairly
skirmishes.
standard response and not something that would have highlighted that there was a real threat and a real concern?
Correct. Not what you're seeing now about storming the Capitol, killing the palace guards, which is referring to my officers. None of that was included in the intelligence, correct?
But that information was available to Ms. Pittman?
It was available to IICD, which is a unit she runs, yes, sir.
All right. And Ms. Pittman approved that report that did not pass that information on to you, is that correct?
It came out of her unit, sir.
Subsequent to January 6th, when Ms. Pittman was retiring, she was given what I call a sweetheart deal from the United States Capitol Police. That was earlier this year. She was placed on leave without pay while working a new job for several months, about 5, before she reached the eligible age to retire. Now, it's clear she had no intent to return to the United States Capitol Police, which is what the handbook says you're supposed to be doing if you get leave without pay. There has to be an expectation of return. During your time in management with the United States Capitol Police, had you ever heard of such a sweetheart deal before?
No, sir.
When you were in management, did counsel Thomas Tad DeBias ever indicate that you had the power to give somebody a leave without pay so they could get to retirement without an expectation that they would at least attempt to return to the United States Capitol Police Service?
No, sir, not that I recall. Nope.
Nobody's ever told you you could do that?
No, sir.
Did you think you had that power?
It's written in the policy that you can't offer.
You can't offer it, but there's a requirement there be an expectation to return. In this
Right.
case, there was not.
That is correct. You're
So
expected
you
to
never
return.
had the expectation that you could give somebody leave without pay unless they were planning on coming back. Somebody that might have a health problem or something like that's what it's for, isn't it?
Correct, that's the policy, that,
All right. Since January 6, 2021, have you learned of other intelligence reports, and I think you mentioned in your opening, in the possession of the United States Capitol Police or other federal agencies, which could have been of assistance to you and your decision-making on January 6th?
yes, sir, I have.
All right. I see that my time is up, and so I will now yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Torres, for 5 minutes.
I join the chairman in welcoming the witness before this committee.
Thank you, ma'am.
Since the insurrection, more than 1,100 individuals have been arrested and charged with crimes associated with the January 6th insurrection. This includes 404 defendants who have been charged with assaulting more than 140 law enforcement officers. 115 of those defendants have been charged with using a deadly or dangerous weapon or causing a serious physical injury to an officer. So far, 770 defendants have been convicted, including 65 defendants who have been convicted of assaulting law enforcement officers. I've had the opportunity to meet with some of the Capitol Police officers who were severely injured and still struggle with the events of that horrible day. Yet, they still show great strength and courage and still serve the force in order to continue to protect us. Mr. Sun, I have a series of easy questions and kindly ask you to answer yes or no. There has been a direct effort here in this committee and by many Republicans to rewrite the violent events that took place here at the Capitol on January 6th. For example, President Trump called the defendants, and I quote, "great patriots." Mr. Sun, do you agree with former President Trump that those convicted of January 6 related offenses are, quote, "great patriots"? Yes or no, sir?
I'm here to try and identify.
It's
the
just a simple yes or no.
institutional
Do
failures.
you believe that the people that assaulted your officers are great patriots? Yes or no?
I think the people that assaulted my officers with weapons and violated the law, assaulting them and injuring them
The
deserve.
former president also said that the rioters that day, and I quote, had love in their heart, and that it was, I quote, a beautiful day. Do you agree, Mr. Sun, with the former president that it was a beautiful day on January 6th, and that those people that attacked your officers had love in their heart?
It was not a beautiful day, ma'am.
And did they have love in their heart while they were attacking your officers, sir?
I don't know what they had in their heart.
Okay, on January 13th, 2021, Speaker Kevin McCarthy, when he was minority leader, said, and I quote, "Last week's violent attack on the Capitol was undemocratic, un-American, and criminal." So, Mr. Sun, do you agree with Speaker McCarthy that the attack on the Capitol was undemocratic, yes or no?
I agree that those that committed violations of laws deserve to
Do
be held
you
accountable.
agree that it was un-American, sir?
Again, I think those that violated the law deserve to be held accountable.
Do you agree that it was criminal?
Yes.
Speaker McCarthy also said, and I quote, "Some say riots were caused by Antifa. There's absolutely no evidence of that." Do you agree, Mr. Sun, that the January 6, 2021 riot was not caused by Antifa, yes or no?
I don't have information to answer that one.
In
way or
fact,
another.
then, Minority Leader McCarthy also went on to say that former President Trump, quote, "bears responsibility for Wednesday's attack on Congress by mob rioters. He should have immediately denounced the mob when he saw what was unfolding." Mr. Sun, do you agree that former President Trump, and I quote, "bears responsibility for the attack"? Yes or no, sir?
Again, ma'am, I'm here to identify the
It's
institutional
a simple
failures.
question, sir. Do you agree that what the incidents that led the president to push people here?
I think this is, if you give me a second, I
Ask you
just
one
think it's
other
part of the reason why
question.
the American
Do you
public is so.
agree that former President Trump should have immediately denounced the mob when he saw what was unfolding at the Capitol, yes or no?
I would have liked some assistance with getting the military to the Capitol. That's correct, ma'am.
Minority Leader McCarthy continued, and I quote, "These facts require immediate action by President Trump. Accept his share of responsibility, quell the brewing unrest, and ensure President-elect Biden is able to successfully begin his term." So my question to you, Mr. Sun, to this day, has former President Trump accepted his share of responsibility or done anything to, quote, "quell the brewing unrest" he cultivated?
I think there's a lot of people that need to accept some responsibility associated with this.
Okay. Finally, Leader McCarthy said, and I quote, "And the president, immediate action also deserves congressional action, which is why I think a fact-finding commission and a censure resolution would be prudent." Unfortunately, Leader McCarthy's courage did not last long. He chose to vote against the bipartisan bill establishing a commission negotiated by the ranking Republican member of the Homeland Security Committee and containing all of his priorities. This is unacceptable, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Ms. Murphy. Mr. Murphy for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just would like to refresh the memory that we were not really allowed to pick our own individuals on that committee, and they were just picked essentially because they didn't like Trump, but that's a secondary issue. I wish Mr. Irving and Mr. Stinger were here today to defend themselves, because from what I'm reading, there's absolutely no defense of themselves. I'm just going through this. So let me go through a little bit. There's a lot of conjecture as to the presence of law enforcement on January 6th. Questions about law enforcement being embedded, plainclothes officers. In my questions to the current Capitol Police Manager, Manger, he was unable to speak about how many plainclothes individuals are there. Chief Sun, while you were Chief of Police, was there a process in place if a federal agency were there in plainclothes or undercover agents?
For coming up on the Hill, sir,
Yeah, on Capitol grounds.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thinking back, do you know if there were any federal officers authorized by the Capitol Police to be operating on the Capitol grounds?
Other than Capitol Police, not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay.
Now, real quick, we did have Secret Service up there with Vice President Pence, and they are also not in uniform. so-
Absolutely. Do you know if the FBI or Department of Homeland Security had any plainclothes employees in the crowd on January 6th?
Only what I'm learning, from GAO report that came out just in.
Are you aware any individuals in the federal government that were wearing bracelets so they could be identified?
Not that I'm personally aware of now.
Okay. Prior to January 6th, do you ever recall an instance in which plainclothes or undercover agents came onto the Capitol grounds without the chief of police approval?
No, sir, not that I recall.
All right, thank you. You know, it's very, very disheartening to read this narrative of when you asked for help, and the 2 days before, they didn't care about doing something because it may have looked bad. When therefore, none of us in this room are saying what happened on January 6th was correct. But I absolutely believe the conditions for that to occur rest at the former speaker's lap and the two sergeant-at-arms and complicit with other individuals. You know, it's one thing for something to occur, but it's another thing to create the conditions for that to occur. Let me ask you this. I'm reading here, Mr. Irving only provided security information to Republicans after receiving distinct instructions from Democratic leadership. On January 4th, he sent a text to Fleet asking him to, quote, act surprised when Irving emailed him and his Republican counterpart information about the joint session. Is there anything wrong with that?
Just want to make sure I understand.
So Fleet basically, Irving basically asked Fleet to act surprised about the information when he was sending it to the Republican. In other words, he knew the information before, but he was withholding it from the minority party.
That's one of the big problems you have with the Capitol Police Board and the Sergeant Arms. They're too politicized.
Well, did you resign because you wanted to?
No, I didn't. I love the Capitol Police. I love the men and women.
I personally believe you were a scapegoat. You were a scapegoat of conditions that were set forth where you could not succeed. What happened on January 6th was unforgivable, but the conditions were set forth by the former speaker and a sergeant-at-arms for the conditions for that to occur. Absolutely. I don't care if the National Guard were out there. I don't care about optics. I care about safety. Absolutely. And it's a dereliction of duty of the former speaker, her staff, and the two sergeant-at-arms. Let me ask one more line of questioning. Pipe bombs. Day before January 6th, live pipe bombs were planted outside the Republican and Democrat Party headquarters. The U.S. Capitol Police has not received any insight into the FBI investigation, which is astonishing because members of Congress on both sides may very well have been targeted by these bombs. During a hearing this summer, the U.S. Capitol Police Board, I called on the board to request a briefing from the FBI to the status of this investigation. The board committed to do so. Mr. Chairman, I submit this letter to the record verifying the request. Chief Sund, before you resign, can you recall anything about the pipe bomb incident?
Other than the time they were called out, us sending resources over to them and hearing both the RNC and the DNC. First one went out the RNC, and I was worried that that could be a distracting for us. And then the second one came out, and that raised a lot of concerns.
To your initial comments originally, here we are several years out. Do you think it's acceptable that the FBI still cannot identify the individual placing the pipe bombs?
I find it very, very surprising, knowing the security level that we have down here, the amount of resources that can be available for an investigation. I'm surprised that we haven't.
I find it absolutely surprising. Same thing with a bag of cocaine in the White House that probably had fingerprints and every camera known to God in that building. And so, again, I'll say what happened on January 6th was absolutely wrong, but the conditions set forth by the Speaker, her administration, and the two sergeant-at-arms and whoever was complicit with that absolutely allowed you to fail, and then members of Congress to be at risk of being injured. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you, Chief, for being here. I do want to, I'm disturbed by both the sense that you don't blame the rioters or the president, but you blame the Capitol Police and the Capitol Police Board, and not you, sir, my colleagues. It's like blaming a homeowner when he or she is robbed instead of blaming the intruder. And so I do want to note one thing, too, because it sounds awfully partisan and awfully political. Just not that I'm blaming anyone, but I just note Mr. Irving is a sergeant-at-arms appointed by John Boehner and reappointed by Speaker Ryan. Mr. Stenger, who's passed away and couldn't testify if we wanted to him, sadly, but was appointed by Senator McConnell. And the third member of the board, which you're not a member of when you were Capitol Police Chief, by the way. The board is 3 other people. I acknowledge that. Third one is the architect of the Capitol, which was at the time Mr. Blanton, appointed by President Trump. So to inject partisanship here, I think, is very troubling. But if we're going to do that, we should at least note the obvious, that each of the members of the 3-person board were appointed by Republicans, not by Democrats. But I do want to go back to a couple of things that I think are really important. One is, I do want to talk a little bit about the delay, which I consider unconscionable between your call with the Pentagon leadership and the ultimate deployment of the National Guard, which, as I understood, took over 3 hours to be able to do. That was a request of the Secretary of Defense. I want to know, Chief, do you know now, or did you know at the time, about a memo on January 4th from the Secretary of Defense to the Secretary of the Army, and a January 5th letter from the Secretary of the Army to the Commanding General of the D.C. National Guard? Are you familiar with those memos?
I've become familiar with them after January 6th, yes, sir.
Yeah, and as I read the material, that among others, they were told that the Guard could not be issued weapons, helmets, body armor. They could not interact physically with protesters. They could not employ any riot control agents, and they could not make arrests and could not use a quick reaction force. Is that your understanding now of the correspondence that went on between the Secretary of the Army and the Secretary of Defense?
Yes, that is correct. The Secretary of Defense wrote the first memo January 4th, and the Secretary of the Army put the additional restrictions on what's called the QRF, the Quick Reactionary Force, to William Walker after the fact.
So, by the way, you said you did not know that leading up to January 6th, that those restrictions were in place, sir?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
And I assume at the time, you would have been led to believe that the National Guard was essentially a phone call away to be able, if necessary, no? Were you not under that belief?
I was definitely under that belief. After I had requested the National Guard Sunday morning, the two sergeant-arms had me reach out to William Walker. Instead of authorizing them, just say, hey, if we need assistance, could you kind of be ready, be on standby? I talked to him 6:14 p.m. that evening, on Sunday evening, the 3rd, and took that information back. He said, yeah, he'd be leaning forward, but he needs authorization from the, he didn't say anything about the memo, because it hadn't come out yet, I guess.
Nor, just so I understand, nor did he say anything about the restrictions that the memo had placed on the deployment of the National Guard should they be requested.
That is correct. And also, just to add additional to that, January 5th, I held a meeting with many of the top law enforcement officials from around the city, including the FBI and the Commanding General for the D.C. National Guard, and nothing was said to me again on that conference call. And that was also with the Capitol Police Board.
You know, and you and I unfortunately didn't have a chance to work professionally together, but I do reach out to Chief Manger from time to time when there are concerns or there are, seemingly threats, and we have conversations. I assume you did that to predecessors on both sides of the aisle, that there would be conversations leading up to events like January 6th, when you knew people would be at least on alert. Is that true?
So a lot of the times, those conversations would go directly to the two sergeant-arms.
Yeah.
Because I know the sergeant-arms that oftentimes would have recommendations to me or advice to me to limit my direct communications with members, because once I open that door, they can't protect me, so they would.
So if this subject came up, you would not, so what I'm getting at, I guess, is neither the Sergeant of Arms nor the architect of the Capitol nor you were aware that the National Guard had restrictions placed on it. So even while you're waiting for the call for hours, you still didn't know that those restrictions were in place. And that seems to me is a big part of this storyline.
That is correct. Knowing those restrictions in place, because I'm a stakeholder. When the police department becomes overwhelmed and we dial 911 because we need assistance, that goes to the National Guard.
Yeah.
It sure as hell would have been great to know that they put out this memo restricting the National Guard from assisting my men and women in advance of January 6th, knowing now that they were so damn concerned about the violence that they were expecting to come on January 6th, and no one ever told me about it.
Yeah, and
That's
that way, I
terrible.
mean, and I hate to state the obvious, but that's the Pentagon's Department of Defense, the Department of the Army. No one at that time told you that the National Guard, even if they were called up, would have severe restrictions. I just want to make sure I did that. And before I yield back, if I might, unless you'd like to call me at another time, just to enter items into the record without objection. If I can do that now, Mr. Chairman, or would you?
Well,
wait?
I would entertain that now, but I think you've got a good line of questioning here. If it's okay with the minority, and we have so few people here, I'd be open to doing another round of questions.
Okay,
if
that's fine. Yes,
So we'll do that then.
Okay, I'll yield back. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Morelli. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. D'Esposito, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief, thank you for being here this afternoon. And thank you for your 30 years of commitment to law enforcement. I know that you are well prepared in incident management, special events, active shooters, investigations. I myself spent a career in the NYPD and know that anytime politics gets involved in law enforcement, it could be or lead to something very dangerous. It's one of the reasons as to why when I first got here, I still question if the Capitol Police Board is the correct oversight and management of the Capitol Police. In your book, you noted how security issues were usually, quote, approached from a political perspective and not based purely on security. What did you mean by that?
So oftentimes, if we were having a major event that was coming up here, whether it was a demonstration, whether it was a healthcare, immigration, or even one of the Supreme Court nominations, we'd put together a security plan. Then the Sergeant Arms, after they reviewed the security plan, would have me go out and brief it to some of the committees. One would often be the Committee on House Administration. When I'd go out and brief what we're going to do, if we're going to put in, fence off the east front of the Capitol, I'd often get pushback about, why do you got to block off the east front of the Capitol? Why do you got to have your people in hard gear? Things that a commander or a chief of police should be able to make those decisions.
So you weren't able to make decisions as a law enforcement professional. Your decisions were based on political interference.
Oftentimes, there would be interference from staffers and members themselves asking, a question about why do you got to have them in.
So individuals that had zero experience in law enforcement were influencing you on the decisions that you had to make for the best interest of this Capitol.
That is correct, sir.
You also noted in your book that as part of your role as chief of police, you had to, quote, cater to a multitude of bosses. In the lead up and on January 6th, who would you have been referring to in this statement?
That would have been mainly the two Sergeant Arms, trying to work things between the two of them.
Moving forward, how do we ensure that security decisions are made solely based on law enforcement expertise and not on politics?
My number one recommendation is you need to depoliticize the Capitol Police Board. You've got two laws out there, and people always bring up, why does leadership get called into things? It's Congress that has leadership listed on laws. You have 2 U.S. Code 1970, 2 U.S. Code 1974, that both list either a review or approval process needed before the Capitol Police can implement those parts of the code. One is special police officers. When we brought in outside resources, we had to swear in special police officers, and there's a requirement that that be approved by leadership. And it specifically says the speaker pro tem, stuff like that. So I would take that out. Let the Capitol Police Board give the police department, let them be the final authority of what constitutes law enforcement actions you're going to take. There's no reason that members of Congress should be involved or listed on laws as approving it. All that does is politicize things. So take them out of it, get a police board that's willing to make, the appropriate decisions, and allow the chief to make decisions to protect the men and women that are our legislators.
I know it's rare on Capitol Hill, but it seems to make perfect sense. Going to January 6th, the actual day, is it true that the National Guard was stationed nearby and could have responded quickly had they been authorized to help by the Capitol Police Board?
That is correct. They were within eyesight of the Capitol. And one thing I'd say real quick as it came up in the last series of questions, I'd have you enter in Joint Publication 3-28 from the Department of Defense, specifically the emergency authority of the National Guard to respond. They can immediately respond. They don't need to wait for anybody else, and there should be no authorization for higher headquarters, instructions. That should be looked at closely.
So you just said that the National Guard was in earshot from
Many were within eyesight. With their
eyesight of the Capitol.
With their riot gear, even though they were told not to have it.
So is it also true that the New Jersey State Police made it to the Capitol before the National Guard did?
That is correct, sir.
Any reason?
The National Guard, who's only 2 miles from our headquarters, sat and waited for the evening crew to come in. While the Pentagon was still sending resources to protect generals' homes, they sent me nobody to help my men and women.
Okay, and I only have 30 seconds left. When were you finally given the green light to bring the National Guard to the Capitol?
At 2:08 p.m., at 2:08 p.m.,
So that was over an hour after you originally asked.
that is correct. I'm sorry, 2:09 p.m. 2:09 p.m., Irving finally gave me approval, because I still remember where I was sitting, because I screamed to the watch commander, mark the time, because I finally got approval to bring in the National Guard.
Well, again, thank you for your service. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Now recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purpose of asking questions. Chief Son, since January 6, 2021, have you testified or been asked to testify publicly before a committee of the House of Representatives?
No, sir.
Did the January 6 Select Committee ask you to publicly testify before their committee?
No, sir.
But you did testify in the Senate, correct?
Yes, sir. The Senate combined hearing, I think it was February 23rd.
Can you briefly tell us about that?
It was a combined hearing. I think it was a really good approach of, how to come in and address it. Initially, they did not want anybody that was no longer in their position to testify, which would have excluded myself, Senate Sergeant Arms Stenger, and House Sergeant Arms Irving. And I went and specifically asked the Senate Rules Committee, please let me come and testify. I will testify in person to show up. They changed the rules and allowed me to show up.
So you had to basically force yourself in to even be able to testify before the Senate
Yeah,
committee.
I had to call in somebody I knew there and tell them, I promise you, I will show up in person. I was the only one to be there in person, not on video.
Thank you for your vigilance there. Chief Son, you previously testified on January 3rd, 2020, or on January 3, 2021, 3 days before January 6. You met separately with House Sergeant at Arms Paul Irving and Senate Sergeant at Arms Michael Stenger. And you asked them to approve a request for National Guard assistance on the 6th. Now, this is on January the 3rd. I believe this was in your book that you met with both Stenger and Irvin and requested National Guard assistance to be ready on the 6th. Can you explain what happened in those two meetings with Irving and Stenger?
Absolutely. So on the morning of the 3rd at 9:24 a.m., I specifically went to see him because I know what a big deal it is to have National Guard come and assist us on the Hill. I went into his office again, 9:24 in the morning, went up and immediately went up and said, hey, I'd like to bring in the National Guard to support me to assist me on the perimeter, because when we have a joint session of Congress, it takes a lot of our personnel inside. But immediately, as soon as I asked him, his first response was, I don't know, I don't like the optics of that. And his second response was, besides, the intelligence doesn't support it. He immediately, then we began talking, he said, have you reached out to Mike Stenger on this? I said, no, I have not talked to him about it yet. He said, why don't you talk to Stenger and see what he has to say? So then I left, went over to Mike Stinger's office at 9:35 in the morning, walked into his office, he wasn't there. I came back, he showed up at 11:13, I showed back up at 11:53 and went in to immediately ask him, I'd like to request the National Guard. He said, let's come up with another idea. Why don't you do you know somebody at the National Guard? I said, yes, sir, I know General William Walker. He said, why don't you call Walker and see if we need them, how quickly could they get here, and how many people could they send us? So I called William Walker 6:14 p.m. that night. He told me they have 125 people assisting with COVID response. He could reallocate those fairly quickly once he got Secretary of Defense approval and send them over.
Okay. When you met with Stenger, had Irvin given him heads up that you were coming to ask for National Guard?
Yeah, later on, after January 6th, specifically on April 8th, I went and had lunch with Mike Stenger. And I asked him, because it was kind of unusual. He came up with that idea so quickly when I went walking in. And I asked him, I said, Mr. Stenger, you came up with that response fairly quickly for me to call General Walker. And he had told me Paul Irving had called him ahead of time and said, son came here looking for asking for the National Guard. We got to come up with another plan. Pelosi will never go for it. I was floored by him saying that.
Okay, so you don't know, I know this word optics has come up several times in the past, or in different contexts. Do you know if Irvin had discussed that with Stenger, if what a possible response would be?
I have no idea, sir.
All right. Around 2 p.m. on January 6th, you joined a call with Metropolitan Police Department Chief Conte and National Guard representatives. According to Chief Conte's transcribed testimony given to the Select Committee, you asked the National Guard to send assistance on that call, and he didn't hear the military people respond to your plea. Is that what you remember?
No, he heard clearly the military respond to my plea and say they recommended against my request for the National Guard. Robert Conti immediately butted in and said, let me get this right. You're denying the chief of the Capitol Police? And again, he just, I can go farther into that if you want.
Okay, thank you. Are you familiar with the term data miner?
I have become familiar with it, yes.
Yeah, and according to a book by Carol Lenning, General Milley was using this tool and reached out to Senator Angus King, warning him about violent rhetoric for January 6th. Some of the intelligence included references to smuggling guns and other weapons into D.C. One message said, let's burn Senator McConnell's house down while he's in it. Another one, seemingly addressed to members who supported certifying the election, said, we're coming to kill you. Just wait a few days. Did General Milley ever reach out to you and share these concerns with you of any of this intelligence?
No, sir.
Do you know if he reached out to either of the sergeant-at-arms?
I have no idea, sir.
Would this intelligence have helped the Capitol Police prepare for January 6th?
Absolutely.
Okay. With that, I do have several other questions, but since we have a second round, at this time, I'll recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Stahl, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Loudermilk, for hosting today's hearing. Thank you, Chief Sund, for being here today. Members of the committee and Congress are thankful for your prior service to the U.S. Capitol Police and your commitment to protecting members, staff, and visitors. My priority as chairman of the Committee on House Administration is to depoliticize Capitol Police. I'm committed to ensuring the U.S. Capitol Police has the tools, resources, and leadership it needs to keep our community safe. I also remain committed to supporting our law enforcement officers and the work they do each day. Today we're here to discuss the security failures that occurred on January 6, 2021, and how we can prevent these failures from occurring again. I want to dive into the questions, Chief Sund. In your transcribed interview, you mentioned that you met with the House Sergeant-at-Arms regarding the National Guard prior to January 6th. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And who was the House Sergeant-at-Arms leading up to and on January 6th?
That would be Paul Irving.
And the House Sergeant-at-Arms is appointed by who?
As appointed at that time by Speaker Pelosi.
And in your transcribed interview, you mentioned that when you first brought up the National Guard to the House Sergeant-at-Arms in the days leading up to January 6th, that Mr. Irving said he, quote, didn't like the optics, end quote. Is that correct?
That is correct. He referenced being concerned for optics.
And on January 6th, when you went to Mr. Irving to get his approval to call in the Guard, Mr. Irving said he would, quote, run it up the chain. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That was a telephone call. I didn't see him in person when I first made that request.
The House Sergeant-at-Arms is considered probably the most senior security official on the House side. When Mr. Irving says he has to, quote, run it up the chain, end quote, what did that mean?
I took that to mean his leadership chain.
And who would be his leadership chain?
It would
If
be
he's functionally the most senior security official on the House side, correct?
That's his title. That's part of the title, the senior law enforcement official for the House of Representatives. But he would have been referring to the leadership team that goes up to Speaker Pelosi.
So the political leadership team, meaning elected officials, not another security official, is that your
That
understanding?
is correct, sir. He's the top security official for the House.
So running up the chain would most likely, in your opinion, is through the Speaker's office and possibly to Speaker Pelosi?
That would be where it ends, yes.
Okay, so let's park that there, and then let's jump to a second set here. In a press conference on January 7th, Speaker Pelosi called for your resignation on national television. Speaker Pelosi also stated that she had not talked to you since the initial breach of the Capitol. But according to your transcribed interview, you were on the phone with Speaker Pelosi a few times. Can you explain that discrepancy?
Yeah, that is correct. I spoke to Speaker Pelosi 3 times that evening, and she went on national TV and said I'd never spoken to her, but I spoke to her 3 times. The three times were the first time when I went over to brief Vice President Pence at the secure location. I'd called House Sergeant-at-Arms Irving, told him I was going over to brief the Vice President. I was also going over to do a personal assessment of the Capitol. At that point, things were getting under control. Went over there, briefed him on when we can get them back into chambers with Mr. Irving being fully aware. He said he wanted to get Speaker Pelosi on the phone. He made a phone call from his cell phone at approximately 5:34, where I first briefed Speaker Pelosi. The second call was when I left that location. As I was walking away, I met up with Mr. Stinger, and we started walking over to the Senate to go brief the Senate, when Jennifer Hemingway, I believe it was Jennifer Hemingway, handed me the cell phone, and it was Emily Barrett's cell phone calling her, and it was Speaker Pelosi on the other line. This is my second call with Speaker Pelosi, questioning the information I'd given to Vice President Pence about when we can get back into chambers. I assured her that information was correct. I could get them back into chambers by 7 p.m., and the call ended. That was call number 2. Call number 3 was 6:25 p.m. I was over at the Senate from the secure location, from where the Senate had been sequestered, and on a cell phone using Robert Karam's cell phone, they dialed leadership, who was over off-site at a secure location, and I briefed all of leadership of the plans to get them back into chambers. That would have been call number 3 with Speaker Pelosi.
So you didn't have one call, you didn't have 2 calls, you had 3 calls. So Speaker Pelosi's comments that she didn't speak to you are inaccurate.
That is correct, sir.
Let me shift gears and go back as it relates to the optics of bringing people up to Capitol Hill and running things up the chain of command, ultimately to the Speaker's office. Do you think Speaker Pelosi's office or Speaker Pelosi herself politicized Capitol security?
I have no idea on that, sir.
Okay. Any other clarifications you'd like to make as it relates to Speaker Pelosi's comments that you didn't speak to her?
I just, wish she had considered that, wish she had considered some of the stuff that I've faced and the efforts I went through to bring in the outside resources on that day before she called for my resignation.
Thank you very much for being here. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Now begin our second round of question. Yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Sun, I have here a statement it's testimony from Paul Irving, the former Sergeant at Arms, and this is testimony he gave to the Senate at a hearing. And he states, on January 5th, Chief Sund and I participated in a web-based interagency conference call with multiple law enforcement partners, the FBI, the MPD, the U.S. Secret Service, the U.S. Park Police, and the Military District of Washington, among other law enforcement agencies from the National Capital Region. Based on the intelligence and threat assessment, everyone on the call believed that we were prepared and the plan met the threat. So you were prepared for what you thought would be a typical demonstration, a First Amendment demonstration on Capitol Hill, such as the Women's March, when we all wore our pink hats and came out and marched against some of the efforts of the president. What you did not anticipate, none of you anticipated, that a Republican member of Congress would tell the crowd on stage, today is the day. American patriots start taking down names and kicking ass, and our ancestors sacrificed their blood, their sweat, their tears, their fortunes, and sometimes their lives. Are you willing to do the same? You didn't anticipate that, did you?
We anticipated some minor skirmishes. We did not anticipate
But you didn't
a
anticipate a Republican member of Congress to go on stage and incite the crowd like this. You also didn't anticipate the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, to tell this, mob that was armed, trial by combat. You also didn't anticipate the President of the United States telling an armed mob to march to the Capitol and then to start walking to the Capitol. I mean, you could not have anticipated any of that, did you?
Well, knowing now that there's
Of course
intelligence.
not. And I believe when you say that, sir, because I do not believe that anyone in charge of the men and women that serve us here in the U.S. Congress, if they had known any of that intelligence, would have acted very differently than we did that day. But I still want you to know that I am grateful for my life, that I am grateful that the officers used their own bodies to protect us, that they bravely fought against these very angry rioters who came here to do violence, to hang the vice president. This past weekend, the former president has said he would pardon those convicted, the ones convicted of crimes associated with January 6th, including individuals like Enrique Tarrio, the leader of the Proud Boys, who was convicted of seditious conspiracy and sentenced to 22 years in prison. Mr. Sun, how does that make you feel to hear that the former president talks about pardoning defendants who assaulted your officers during that violent attack and assault on our democracy?
Again, I feel if they assaulted the officers, they need to pay the consequences.
I feel really badly for everything that has happened since the officers, the suicides. No one deserved that. I wanted to really stay focused on who to blame, who is to blame for everything that happened on January 6th. And I attended this peaceful transfer of power on this inauguration when this president took the oath to serve this country and to protect, the rule of law and democracy. I also attended, by the way, I was not wearing a vest at this ceremony because Democrats did not incite a crowd and say those Russians that interfere in our election, were at fault for us losing. We took the loss and we did the right thing by ensuring that we had a peaceful power of transfer. Unfortunately, when I attended Mr. Biden's inauguration, I had to wear a vest because I no longer felt safe. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. I now yield to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
So, Mr. Sund, you also did not anticipate that you wouldn't get significant intelligence about the threat. Isn't that true?
That is correct. With the intelligence,
You would have anticipated that either your own department or other federal agencies would have alerted you to the risk. Isn't that true?
like I've said, this could have been preventable if we had gotten the intelligence they had.
And isn't it also true that you would not have anticipated and did not anticipate that you wouldn't get support from up the chain when you requested the National Guard before and on January 6th? Isn't that true?
That is correct, sir.
And during a February 2021 joint Senate hearing, former House Sergeant at Arms Paul Irving testified that on January 6, 2021, he did not receive a request from you for National Guard assistance until around 2 p.m. Is that accurate?
That is not accurate, sir.
When did you ask for it?
12:58 p.m. was my first call to Paul Irving. I had a number of people that were surrounding me that were aware I was calling, and he was fully aware of just how bad it was outside because he had his representative to the command center right behind me sending him all the information of what was happening. And I did not get the approval at 12:58 p.m.
And he still said he was going to run it up the chain.
He's going to run it up the chain. It took 71 minutes to get an approval.
To get it run up the chain.
Yes, sir.
And your assumption, although you testified that you don't know for sure that it went to Nancy Pelosi, your assumption is that because the Sergeant at Arms, while elected by the members of the House, is generally put on the ballot by the Speaker and serves at the direction of the Speaker, so you assumed, as most people would, that it was the Speaker that was the top of the chain.
Yeah, that was my assumption.
Based on the flow chart that I'm aware of, there is nobody between the Sergeant at Arms and the Speaker. Do you know of somebody in between the two of them?
No, sir, I don't.
I don't either. All right. Now, you had some phone calls with Mr. Irving. Do you have the records of what times you had those phone calls?
Yes, sir, I do.
Would you please tell them to the committee?
Let's see, if I don't have them, I'd be happy to submit my phone records. My phone records have all been submitted. They were submitted to the Senate hearing, full accounting of my phone records. Yeah, I don't have hold on just a second. I don't have the exact times.
But you made, my recollection is, and I've read your book, but my recollection is you made several calls within a relatively short period of time. If it took 71 minutes to run up the chain, is my information correct that you called 3 times? The first one that you just told us about, and then 2 more?
Those are-
During that 71 minutes?
No, those are
That was-
calls with Speaker Pelosi. Those that I just went over those times, those were calls with Speaker Pelosi.
Those were calls with Speaker Pelosi.
Between 12:58 and 2:09, when I finally got approval 71 minutes later, I made 11 calls to the Sergeant at Arms asking what's going on, first asking for the request, and then 10 follow-up calls saying what's going on with the request.
11 calls during the
Yes, and
roughly an hour and 10 minutes.
during that time, I was calling every leader of every agency, Gary Settles with Virginia State Police, Secret Service, anybody I could get to come to my aid. I activated mutual aid around the Maryland, Virginia, and that's what brought in the New Jersey State Police at 1:51 p.m. Still while calling every couple of minutes to find out where the hell my approval was for the National Guard.
Now, being from Virginia, did the Virginia state troopers come in to help?
Yes, sir, they did.
And did they get here before the National Guard too?
Yes, sir, they did.
Wow. All right. USCP hired Julie Farnham as the Assistant Director of Intelligence and Interagency Coordination Division in November of 2020 when the former director retired. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And she testified previously that you wanted to overhaul the department. Is that correct?
I wanted
She
to,
wanted to overhaul the department.
she may have,
Farnham.
I'm not aware.
Okay. All right. So but did you think at the time, on January 6th, did you think your intelligence department was defective?
That is correct. I thought the intelligence they were providing us was,
Prior to January 6th?
prior to January 6th, absolutely. They had been effective on any previous demonstration. I mean, we handled a Supreme Court nomination where we made hundreds of arrests, and that was effective intelligence, absolutely.
That was effective. So they were effective prior to January 6th. You didn't see the cracks in the system until after that. Is that accurate?
That is correct, sir.
All right. I appreciate your testimony here today, and I'm glad you've been able to correct some of the misstatements that have been made by others, and I yield back.
Thank you, sir.
The gentleman yields. Chief Son, before I recognize the ranking member of the full committee, would you be willing to submit those phone records to this subcommittee for our records?
Absolutely, sir. I'll have them to you by the end of the day.
All right, thank you, sir. Now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do note, since there seems to be a fair amount of conversation and speculation about what happened in the conversations between Mr. Irving and Speaker Pelosi, why Mr. Irving wasn't asked to testify in front of this panel. You could have asked him to come. I assume that you chose not to because it's easier to speculate on the conversations rather than ask him to testify, and I assume he would have been here to testify, but in any case. Since there seems to be a real focus on the 1 hour that there's a dispute over whether or not authorization was given, I am a little surprised that there's no frustration or concern about the 3.5 hours between the time you did place the call, and I did understand, sir, you placed the call at 2:30, according to your testimony here, to requesting National Guard support.
No, so to correct it, I couldn't wait any longer. I'd waited so long for the approval from the Capitol Police Board, both Mr. Irving and Mr. Stinger. At 1:51 p.m., I called William Walker without even having authority and said, please get ready, send me anything you got.
Gotcha.
This is life or death. I told him I don't have approval from the Capitol Police Board yet, but it's coming any minute, but please start sending me resources.
Gotcha.
So it was 1:51
That
when I
was
first made that
before
call.
2 o'clock, and yet, and when did the National Guard show up?
5:40 p.m., the first National Guard showed up, approximately 150, and they were sworn in as special police officers and deployed. They got on post about 6 p.m. When the Capitol grounds were secure at that point.
Okay, so that is over 3.5 hours after your request was put in.
Yes, sir.
Earlier I was asking about this, and I would like to just get a little more definition on it. So you didn't know it at the time. When you made the request at 1:50 or so, did you know that, when were you made aware that there were restrictions on what the National Guard could do as a result of the memo that had been issued on the 4th and 5th?
I don't know the exact date, but it was definitely after January 6th when I started doing research into what happened. That's when I found it.
But when they showed up at 5:40, so do you have any sense of the 3.5 hours that went on? You said, I just want to make sure, you said in an interview that there was a concern in the administration about the president invoking the Insurrection Act and concern at the Pentagon about him declaring martial law or activating the military in support of his claims. Do you suspect that played a role in the Pentagon's unwillingness to allow the National Guard to respond to the Capitol, that those hours that was being debated?
So when I went back and started doing research for the book I wrote, I started finding out there was a lot of concerns within the president's cabinet about him invoking the Insurrection Act. And that was one of the hypotheses that had come up, that maybe they were concerned about him invoking it, and that's why they'd want to delay. And think about it. I think the Secretary of Defense has come out and stated in testimony he was not putting National Guard anywhere east of 9th Street Northwest, which means toward the Capitol. So why would that be?
I don't know. Why do you speculate?
Like I am saying, for some reason, they want to do everything they could to keep National Guard away from the Capitol.
Yeah. I would wonder why my colleagues aren't more concerned about that. I mean, that's 3.5 hours while we're under siege. A request has been made. Can you describe the scene during the period between your call and the arrival of the National Guard here at the Capitol?
Between my first call at
Your call at
12:58,
2 o'clock, 1 until 5:40?
it was, I mean, I was seeing my officers go through some intensive battling on the West Front. It was terrible what they were going through, and no police officer deserves to be subjected to that. It was some of the worst violence I've seen against law enforcement.
So let me ask this then. How would the situation have differed had the National Guard's quick reaction force been able to deploy soon after your call, which I assume would have been just minutes away?
Yeah, if they had followed their emergency authority and they had deployed the quick QRF, we could have had close to 200 National Guardsmen, men or women, here fairly quickly. That could have been a game changer. The Metropolitan Police Department sent me almost 1,000 officers. That would have been the next largest cadre of officers. We could have absolutely used their assistance.
Yeah. You know, I on a sort of tragic circumstance, you obviously know about then Police Lieutenant Michael Byrd and the interaction, which ultimately led to the death of Ashley Babbitt, who was a rioter when she tried to break into the Speaker's lobby. Because of his actions, now Captain Byrd and his family have had to face an onslaught of threats and been the target of vile attacks, some of them racist. Just a few weeks ago, a family member of Miss Babbitt said publicly that Michael Byrd needs to swing from the end of a rope. Do you have any reaction to that comment?
No comment on that.
No comment. Before I yield back, may I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the following. An article from the Washington Post fact checker dated December 15, 2021, entitled, "No, Trump did not order 10,000 troops to secure the Capitol on January 6th. An article from CNN entitled, "Fact-Checking Representative Jordan's Claim That Speaker Pelosi Was Responsible for U.S. Capitol Security on January 6th. A memorandum from the Secretary of Defense to the Secretary of the Army dated January 4th, 2021, restricting the activities of the D.C. National Guard. A letter from the Secretary of the Army to the Commanding General of the D.C. National Guard dated January 5th, relaying those National Guard restrictions. An excerpt from the Select Committee's transcribed interview with former House Sergeant-at-Arms Paul Irving. A copy of H-Con Res 40, a concurrent resolution expressing support for law enforcement officers that explicitly excluded the United States Capitol Police. A copy of an amendment to H-Con Res 40 offered in the Rules Committee by Ranking Member McGovern expressing gratitude to the Capitol Police who protected the Capitol on January 6th. A copy of the vote tally on the amendment, which was defeated on a party line 8-3 vote, all Republicans voting against. A tweet by Representative Matt Gaetz dated September 14th, 2023, in which he pledges to hold Speaker McCarthy to his promise to release the full January 6 tapes. Tweet by Representative Matt Gaetz dated September 18th, 2023, in which he demands full release of the January 6 tapes in exchange for funding the government. And finally, a letter from Capitol Police Chief Tom Manger to Chairman Stile and myself dated September 18th, 2023, in which he renews his request to review all video footage requests received by the committee and address security concerns prior to release. Without objection.
Without objection. Now I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. D'Esposito, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make it very clear that I think all of our colleagues, the Republicans, have been very concerned about the response of the National Guard, which is why most of us have asked questions about the timing, about the authority, about you getting permission and the fact that you had to get answers from two individuals who clearly were taking their orders from Speaker Pelosi. So I just want to make that very clear. Just touching quickly on the chamber evacuations, the Capitol was breached at 2:12 p.m. The House chamber did not start evacuating to 2:28. What was the reason for the delay?
I'm not really sure what the reason for the delay is.
Okay.
They should have been called, the evacuation should have definitely been called earlier.
And who would have made that decision?
When I was up in the command center, I had two assistant chiefs with me that are in charge of operations. I had one assistant chief that's in charge of member protection, intelligence and protection, one in charge of uniformed operations. Either of those could have called it, but it should have been called earlier.
Okay. And do you know what time the Senate chamber was evacuated?
I'll see if I have it in my, give me 1 second, sorry about that. I'm sorry. I don't have that right in front of me
Okay.
right now, sir, sorry.
No worries. So I'll move on to something else. So yesterday, Chairman Stile hosted a security briefing here in this room, brought all the stakeholders, the law enforcement agencies that oversee the Washington, D.C. area into one room to talk about the spiking violent crime and what we can do better. And I think something that has been a common theme, and probably not one that we're really proud of, but a common theme that we've all heard is staffing issues when it comes to the Capitol Police. Obviously, I think any law enforcement agency around the country right now would agree that the more people in uniform, the better. In your book, you wrote that on January 6th, United States Capitol Police would be subjected to the greatest staffing demands on the department's limited resources. And that, quote, this would make pulling together the staffing for a large CDU detail even more difficult. What was it specifically about January 6th and the joint session that placed such significant demands on the staffing of your department?
Anytime you have a joint session of Congress where you have both the House and Senate in session as well as the Vice President, they're holding a joint hearing. It's going to take a lot of work. And the problem that we have is with the Electoral College, when you're in there doing the certification, it can likely run into the early morning hours. So you have to prepare for 24-hour staffing for that. So that's what takes a lot of the resources. You know, we had prepared for, I think it was 223 hard CDU officers, as well as some officers on the perimeter. And that's about the most we can get on the outside. But it takes a lot of our staffing on the inside, sir.
So you spent over 3 decades in the law enforcement arena. Public safety, emergency management, it's all kind of tied in there. And as someone who has spent most of his adult life in the emergency management world, one of the questions that we always ask ourselves is, are we better off today than we were when we saw the last event unfold? And my question to you is, are we better off today than, God forbid, if we saw an event like January 6th unfold again?
So I continue to be concerned. I know like you'd mentioned, I think there was an influx of money coming in. That was key for getting some of the equipment and helping out with the training, but the officers are still very, very short. They're getting overworked, they're getting held over, and still making training difficult. But I would say as far as some of the equipment coming in, yes. As far as some of the politicization, which is the number one thing I'd recommend, you know, there's no reason you should be going and having members of Congress in an approval or review category for laws overseeing the Capitol Police. So that needs to be restricted. You know, let the Capitol Police Chief do his job.
I agree.
That's the number one thing I can say.
Leave policing to the law enforcement professionals.
That is correct. And if they mess up, hold them accountable.
Exactly. Well, thank you for your service, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I also want to clarify something Mr. Morelli brought up regarding bringing Mr. Irving before this committee. It is the intention of this committee to bring Mr. Irving before our committee, whether in a hearing or in a transcribed interview, which if either takes place, we will notify the minority and invite them to participate. With that, I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Stile, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Want to go back to your recollections in the transcribed interview of Mr. Irving. He said that on January 6th, the initial statement about the guard occurred on a phone call. You noted it's in his office, which is correct.
Can you repeat the question, sir? Just so I...
Yeah, no, absolutely. Mr. Irving said that on January 6th, the initial statement about the guard occurred on a phone call. You contend that you went into his office to discuss the guard.
On January 6th?
Yes.
No, sir, I was in the command center on January 6th when we became under attack at 12:53. I was
Okay.
there for several hours until I left at approximately 5 p.m. to go see the vice president and go check on the Capitol.
Thank you. On January 6th, Mr. Irving said that when you called and asked his permission to ask for the guard, he gave you permission. Is that correct?
That is false. I think if you look at his testimony, he says when I first called him, I want to, just for clarification, at 2 o'clock, because I think his testimony is before I was saying I might be needing the National Guard. That is absolutely not true. When I first called at 12:58, I absolutely said we need the Guard now. I think my response was, I think we're getting our asses handed to us. And so, no, it wasn't correct that he gave me approval on the first call.
So when comparing your transcribed interview with the January 6th committee and the transcribed interview of Mr. Irving, there seems to be some pretty big discrepancies in the timeline of events and how they happen. Can you explain the discrepancies?
Maybe there's problems with recollection. The one thing I'd say is when you think there's discrepancies, realize that Congress did try and change the law to correct those discrepancies in the sense of they changed the law, giving the chief the authority now. So obviously they agree with my position.
Well, I thank you for being here, Mr. Sund, and we really are working as chair of the full committee to depoliticize Capitol Police. I remain concerned that under the previous Congress, under the previous speaker, Capitol Police was politicized, and we're working to depoliticize the security apparatus on Capitol Hill. With that, I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank the committee chairman for his questions and being here today. Now I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Just to finish up on the previous question, line of questioning regarding General Milley and his notification to the Senate of this particular intelligence, you had stated he did not notify you. Do you know if General Milley notified the Intelligence Division at all of this intelligence?
I have no idea, sir.
Okay. From what I recall, and I believe it was in your book, you had issued an all-hands-on-deck for officers to be present and on duty on January 6th. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
Do you know, was that order put in place with the Intelligence Division?
The Intelligence Division actually, it's funny you say that. The Intelligence Division had 2/3 of their personnel working from home that day, so no, it was not put in place, and only had one intelligence analyst assigned to monitor the January 6th events.
So even though you issued an all-hands-on-deck, this would have been Yogananda Pittman's call. She had nearly 70% of her workforce at home?
At least of that one unit, when you talk about the intelligence. She has a larger work.
That's right, she was over a larger, but yeah, so the intelligence, do you know why they chose to not order their people to come to work?
No, sir, I've not been able to follow up on that.
Very interesting. Are there any pre-existing, or when you were chief, was there any pre-existing agreements between the Metropolitan Police Department and Capitol Police that would allow MPD to come onto Capitol grounds without the approval from the chief or the police board?
Well, you got to understand, there's a number of thoroughfares through the Capitol grounds that Metropolitan Police will patrol regularly, Constitution Avenue, Independence Avenue, so they have to traverse the Capitol when you call the Capitol grounds regularly. For them to be coming up and coming into one of our buildings, it usually requires approval and notification for them to be able to come in and be invited in.
From our research, the only directive that we've seen with the Metropolitan Police Department, which dates back about 10 years, is that no officer can come onto Capitol grounds, patrol Capitol grounds, or enter any Capitol building without the explicit approval or request by the Capitol Police Board. So you don't know that there is anything that has superseded that?
No, I don't. I'd have to say that there is a Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments mutual aid agreement that I believe exists, but I don't know how that interacts with that.
The mutual aid agreement that you enacted, is that same mutual aid agreement?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What time did you enact that?
I enacted that at approximately 1:51. I called Scott Boggs over at the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. but also realize that I did call Metropolitan Police Department right at 12:55. We were attacked at 12:53. At 12:55, I'd called MPD and asked them to send in the resources. I'd called earlier that morning at 10:55 and asked Chief Carroll if he could put additional resources on Constitution Avenue in case we needed them.
Now, that would have been off to Capitol grounds at that point?
I believe it would have been right on the edge of Capitol
the
grounds. I
edge.
think it
Okay.
actually technically would have been on Capitol grounds, correct?
Were you made aware that MPD would be sending their emergency services unit in plain clothes to be in the crowd?
Their,
I mean, I'm sorry, their electronic
oh, I'm
services
sorry.
unit, ESU.
No,
Yeah.
no, sir, was not aware of that.
Okay, we actually have evidence and records indicating plainclothes MPD officers were on Capitol grounds on January 6th. And you're saying you weren't aware that they would have embedded those officers within the crowd? They didn't make you aware of that?
No, no, sir, they did not make me aware of it. It's not unusual for agencies to have plainclothes units deployed around major events, but no, I was not made aware that they'd be on Capitol grounds.
Okay, some of what actually Metropolitan Police provided to us, camera footage, body cam footage, shows that there were undercover agents in the crowd, with one apparently encouraging some of the protesters to enter the Capitol. That would, I assume you would think that that was uncalled for or unprofessional.
I haven't seen that. If it turned out to be a police officer involved in that, that would be inappropriate.
Okay. When did you come on as acting chief? I know it was 2017, what month?
January. It was beginning of January, first week of January.
So you were acting chief at the time that someone crazed by political rhetoric came on the baseball field, which I was on, and began shooting at members of Congress, Republican members.
Yes, sir.
That after-action report, do you remember that after-action report?
I do, yes.
We had two Capitol Police officers involved in that, and from what I remember, it was a pretty significantly large after-action report. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd have to remember exactly, but yeah, that's Crystal Griner and David Bailey that were heroic in that event. But yes, substantial. I was involved in that as well as, other after actions.
Have you seen the Capitol Police after-action report on January 6th?
Yes, sir. The 27-page after action. Yes, sir.
Does it surprise you that it's only 27 pages long? As when, how many officers were here that day?
I called in 1,700 officers, as well as there was a total of 18, our total was 1,457. So you figure a little over 3,000, 3,200 officers. Now, I would have expected a much larger after action. I was involved in the Navy Yard as the incident commander there. The after action there was at least 3 times that length.
So that's what amazes me, is that this after-action report of the Capitol, or the baseball shooting with 2 officers involved, 15 or 16 members of Congress, received this comprehensive after-action report, but the January 6th after-action report literally is just a handful of pages, and it's very sketchy. Who was responsible for that after-action report?
I don't remember the exact date that it was published. I don't know if that would have been the acting chief Pittman or the new chief Manger.
Yeah, I think it was acting chief Pittman. Finally, this will be my last question. I appreciate you being here with us and being so vigilant. You have mentioned earlier, in response to a question by the minority, that there should be others that are held accountable to this. Who else do you believe that should be held accountable?
So when I talk about holding people accountable, I think, you're dealing with a morale issue, I think, right now on the police department. That's one of the big issues that you face when you talk to the officers. And I agree with Representative Torres. These were heroic officers. They're working really hard all the time, and I appreciate that. But there's a morale issue. And I think part of that morale issue goes to the fact that people haven't been held accountable. Failures haven't been identified, and people that have been left in certain positions that should be identified as contributing to some of the issues we had that day.
But in contrasting that, there are individuals who, I believe you even mentioned this in your book, that acted above and beyond the call of duty or above and beyond their position, who were actually terminated from the Capitol Police, and there were many whistleblowers that were retaliated against. And that's exactly what we're trying to get at here. We thank you for spending time with us today. Thank you for your service. It's been exemplary. And look, you had the ability to just step away and go in obscurity like some that were here that day have. But you chose to stand up and see that justice is done, and that more importantly, that we do correct the wrongs and we secure this Capitol. It is not the intention, as has been mentioned several times, for this committee to rewrite history. History is there. Violence was done. We want to get to the truth of how there was a security failure at this Capitol so that we can ensure that it never happens again. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for you. We ask you please respond to those in writing. Yes, sir. Without objection, each member will have 5 legislative days to insert additional material into the record or to revise and extend their remarks. If there's no further business, I thank the members for their participation. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.